Chapter 10, The Mandate of Heaven. Okay, so where were we? Oh, right, trying to take over the world. At last count, we have started by cleansing our heads of trying to take over anything. We have adopted the ideology of pacifism, the antithesis of progressive activism. Pacifism follows directly from the reactionary revocation of the Lockean right of rebellion. The pacifist replaces Locke's chestnut with an older, truer formula: might makes right. USG has the might, so it has the right. The pacifist does not rebel against USG because he has not the right to do so. He has not the right to do so because he has not the power to do so. Can a person believe that might makes right and still call himself a libertarian? Easily. The converse of the principle is that where USG has not the might to act, it has not the right. Thus, the reactionary libertarian, believing that might makes right, believes it is wrong of USG to ineffectively outlaw a little plant that anyone can grow in his closet. Sovereignty, being absolute, must therefore be Boolean. Notice how backward and reactionary pacifism is. We have popped ourselves right out of the 20th century Anglophone tradition and turned the clock back to the 17th on the royalist side.
All right, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the official Urbit Foundation monthly address. This is the second wartime address. Curtis, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing great. I'm here in my office. Just kidding. I'm here in someone else's office. I'm actually here in the Explorers Club in New York due to an odd set of circumstances that something happened in the subway. I can't even repeat it, right? And I found myself here. And not only am I in front of a beautiful collection of ancient Persian weapons, I have the scepter of the Grand Vizier. So, or some kind of vizier, maybe not a grand vizier, maybe like a petty vizier, kind of lower level vizier. So, you know, I'm prepared to make my wartime address under these
Awesome,
circumstances.
great. That's awesome. It's a great look for you. I like it.
Probably not to be repeated, alas, but you know.
So, for everyone who's joining us, maybe for the first time, last month we did the first wartime address. This was Curtis's first statement to the larger Urbit community, where he also fielded questions at length. That was about a month ago, and I think the intention now is to make these monthly because a lot of people came out. It seemed like a really good and healthy thing for the Urbit ecosystem. So this is the second one, and this one will probably be a little bit less long. Curtis has some time constraints tonight, whereas last time it was a marathon stream. Maybe sometimes we'll do that, but I think the safe expectation is probably around an hour is what we'll aim for.
What Justin means is I fucked up the schedule, but go on, Justin.
No, it's all good. We have about an hour, even a little bit more, so that's more than enough time. Just letting people know it's not going to be a 3-hour marathon like last time. And just so everyone knows how we do this, this is broadcasting live on Twitter and on YouTube right now for anyone interested in following along with the remarkable kind of story arc that Urbit is undergoing right now. But for people who are on Urbit, members of the actual Urbit community, we will be fielding questions throughout this session. So if you're on the radio app on Urbit, I'm watching the chat right here. And that's the only place that we're going to be looking for questions from and introducing questions for. So if you have questions, please, and you're in the Urbit community and you're in the radio app, please let us know what your questions are, and I will bring them up to Curtis, and Curtis will give them a direct address. I think the game plan for tonight is we are going to just go over some updates on what's been going on since the last address about a month ago. Curtis will give us any updates and anything he's sort of refined in his mind, anything that's come into focus since last month, or any interesting new updates at all. We'll update everyone on whatever Curtis has, and then all of the rest of the time will be for questions. So please don't be shy. Curtis wants to address frankly and head on anything that people are thinking about or wondering about. And so it should be a fun time. So with that being said, Curtis, are there any kind of big updates or anything on your mind, top of mind, that you want to start off with?
Well, there's certainly no absolute news. We've been, despite, so at some point this moniker of wartime will have to give way to like reality. But I'm still happy with the Persian swords behind them because if you want peace, prepare for war. And but we've been, in a way, at the Urbit Foundation really settling into our kind of program going forward, which I think is a relatively clear and interesting program. We basically have, we're working on a bit of a shoestring and working to raise funds at the same time as we basically work forward on the agenda. And, what is the agenda? It's sort of good to like take a step back and say, what is the agenda of the Urbit Foundation? But even before saying what is the agenda of the Urbit Foundation, I want to take a big step back and say, okay, many people out there may not be sort of familiar with the complicated structure of the Urbit world, because it's not just one organization in any way, shape, or form. And like part of the sort of the complex situation is the complex and even, you would say, frankly, political dynamic between the pieces of the Urbit ecosystem. So the oldest and most core piece of the Urbit ecosystem is a company named Tlon, which was founded by me and eventually Galen Wolf-Pauly in 2013, after I'd been working on Urbit in my basement for about 11 years. And we created Tlon and did a kind of very, very like the concept of Urbit address space was already real, but this was well before certainly it wasn't before Bitcoin, but it was before Ethereum. And so it was kind of a pre-crypto project in a way, but it had many of the principles of crypto. And we created a company, Tlon, to commercialize this. We famously got into Y Combinator and then turned them down, which is probably a stupid decision, but it was also kind of cool. And kind of, like this was a very ambitious, of course, is a very ambitious technical project. And to basically create something that's a decentralized, purely functional operating system that works on basically principles that are just completely different from all of 20th century computing, and to turn that into a real thing, which, okay, not everyone in the world uses it today, but certainly hundreds of, if not thousands of daily users in a system that works. It's kind of it's a mind-boggling achievement. And that was something that was done by Tlon. Moreover, one of the things that Tlon did and here I have to credit Galen entirely because I'm actually not cool at all. Galen did something even more important, and we'll get back to this in our years together at Tlon. And that was only starting to bear fruit when I left the company in 2018, which is that he made Urbit cool. And like actually being cool is like super important. And it's not necessarily the first thing that you think of when you're just like a system software designer who went to grad school in Berkeley or whatever the fuck, right? You're just like, how do you make this cool? And so Urbit by 2018 was clearly on the path of working and clearly on the path of becoming cool. And I felt that, I had many reasons for leaving, but one of them was that I felt that I kind of sucked oxygen out of the room. And I wanted basically kind of new, especially technical leaders to emerge. And that's one of the only parts of my plan that I really feel worked very well, is kind of the new technical leadership that was sort of created in my absence. But, sort of enough of that. Urbit was always designed to be two things, essentially Tlon, which basically runs the product experience, and then the Urbit Foundation, which basically owns and kind of pushes forward kind of core Urbit. The separation was sort of purely abstract, basically, based on some annotations in a cap table, in the Galaxy cap table before I left. After I left, it became concrete, and the Urbit Foundation was spun out from Tlon. And like any spin out, I would say I'm going to be struggling when I kind of describe the dynamics here. I know you all want me to be too frank. I'm not going to be too frank. I'm going to be exactly the right amount of frank. And one thing I would say, about the history of this situation is that it's really, really hard when you spin one entity out of another to actually separate them with a sort of in the proper structural way. And we found ourselves dealing, with the new management at the Urbit Foundation. We found ourselves dealing with basically a lot of sort of various kinds of, mistakes and missteps and omissions in this process. But be that as it may, the Urbit Foundation, which is actually a foundation registered in the Cayman Islands, of all places. I don't know. I haven't been to the Cayman Islands. I'm not sure anyone at the UF has been to the Cayman Islands, but it sounds like a really cool place for a meetup, to be honest. And it's somewhere in the Caribbean. And so the Urbit Foundation is a Cayman foundation. And the idea in creating the Urbit Foundation was that it would handle essentially Urbit core development, while Tlon, the original company, focused on two different things, one of which was basically hosting, and the other one was getting a really, really slick user experience. And the thing to know about Tlon today is they are working very, very hard on both of these things, and in particular, delivering a kind of next generation Urbit user experience. So, and the Urbit Foundation was doing basically core development of various kinds, and also sort of, long-term maintenance. Over time, there were other, corporate dramas, and I'm only going to mention basically two other players that currently exist. One of them is a company called Zorp with a product called Noctchain. And Noctchain, I think no one at Zorp or Urbit or Tlon or the UF or Tlon is quite sure of what the relationship between Zorp and Urbit is. We know that Zorp is basically built on a lot of Urbit technologies, and they're essentially building a zero knowledge proof of work chain, which uses Nock, which is our virtual machine that fits on a t-shirt, as its basic interpreter. It turns out that Nock, although obviously I did not imagine anything of the kind at the time, Nock is a kind of very self-contained Pico Lisp. Turns out to be very, very good for zero knowledge proofs. It's good at diagonalizing an algorithm into essentially a number. And if that's the right term, I forget all my theory. And so, a lot of people sort of within the core development culture have tended to start to move around between these organizations. There are two basically others that I would mention. One of them is Red Horizon, which is a hosting company competing with Tlon. Opinions vary on who is cheaper and more reliable. I know it's greatly disputed. But what's certain is that they're both working extremely hard, and they have gotten the cost of reliable hosting down by several orders of magnitude from when I was there, and as it should be, because Urbit is meant to be cheaply hosted. Wow, I have e-girls threatening to join us. Yes,
I'm featuring some people from the YouTube chat. You can disregard it unless you feel like riffing on
it. Yeah, we could. That would be an interesting riff. Why don't we bring up Leah very quickly for one question? Because she's a friend of mine. I know her well.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. That's not really an option to bring people up.
Okay.
I'm shouting people out, basically.
You're shouting people out. Okay, fair enough. I was going to turn this into a circus, and that's probably not a good idea. Yeah, all the cool Dime Square e-girls are here. I really appreciate that. Pariah Doll, whose face just appeared there, is actually turned me on to her brand of you can buy research peptide Ozempic, basically not for human use, and inject it yourself. And everyone's like, Curtis, you're looking so good. And I'm like, I've been training for the Ozempics, which is true, right? So thank you for Pariah for turning me on to these peptides, which cost approximately 1/20th of real Ozempic. Just go to arcticpeptides.com and say I sent you. Anyway, so the two other organizations that I want to mention, well, there's three actually. They're slightly smaller ones. There's Red Horizon, which does hosting and also does some work on the new Sky product or Sky browser, of which more anon. And there was also Native Planet, which is working on kind of hardware home Urbit hosting systems. And there's also a new company called Groundwire. I'm not sure they're even a company yet, which is working on basically somewhat speculatively trying to port their Urbit PKI to Bitcoin ordinals. And so this is a really complicated, this is an ecosystem. And what's neat about this ecosystem is that you know, it's like an ecosystem, a company is killable. A company cannot die, can die. An ecosystem can't really die. And what we see really, that's sort of one of the like both, joys and curses of like my day involved in this, is that basically across these various corporate entities, a really strong kind of aristocratic culture, and I'm not ashamed of using that word, a really strong aristocratic culture has developed, which is basically the culture of every cool open source project. And the culture of every cool open source project is like, are we not the coolest nerds in the world for working on the coolest open source project in the world? That is as it should be. And let me tell you what the coolest open source project in the world is. It's Urbit. Right. And so, and moreover, one of the things, it's like one of my common lessons is basically the quality of a society can only decline of a community of a group of people, whatever, Usenet and Eternal September, et cetera, et cetera. I sort of believe that totally. And yet when I basically go away for 5 years and come back, what I see is that I'm just like, frankly, I wish we'd had engineers of this quality 5 years ago. Right. Actually, the community has gotten better, but it's also spread across all of these divergent organizations with all of these different structural incentives pulling them in different directions. And so a lot of what I'm working on and thinking about these days is just essentially preserving, the all important unity. And here I'm going to use the Vizier's scepter again, the all important unity of Urbit, because basically any kind of division in this unity, any kind of fork, whether it's a blockchain fork or a repository fork, or any kind of division, really very strongly diminishes the value of the whole thing. And, I want to basically describe, in terms of kind of the value of the whole system, let me take something from I hate that I can't show you the decks that we're using to talk to investors, but I can't. But let me take basically a piece from this. And essentially, our strategy at the Urbit Foundation, our mission at the Urbit Foundation is to promote Urbit. And by Urbit, I mean promoting essentially the society of Urbit, the system of decentralized names that is Urbit. And when you're promoting the system of decentralized names that is Urbit, you're building that society in every possible way, from like fun New York parties with lots of cool e-girls to building system software. All of those are within the remit of the Urbit Foundation, whose philanthropic mission, because we are a nonprofit, is to promote Urbit as a society. But more broadly, what promoting Urbit as a society means is that, and I think I described this in the last talk, but not everyone has seen both. Urbit is essentially two things. It's a decentralized identity system, and it's a decentralized computing system. And so as a decentralized identity system, it's just a PKI. It's just a system of keys that I am Sargnampive. I'm Sargnampive because I know a secret that no one else knows, just like any other NFT, any other system like this. And the goal of the Urbit Foundation in basically driving this decentralized identity standard is to essentially drive, the community of people that uses this standard and that thinks of them. Urbit people will be like, they'll go to a conference and be like, "Hi, Sarg." Like these names really very naturally become nicknames. They're very human shaped names. And the more humans attach more meaning to this namespace, the more it develops and the more it basically goes from becoming hopeful to possible to inevitable. Because one of the things about a network, and Urbit is a network in two senses. It's a network in that it's a system software stack and a computer network, and the two are completely bonded to each other at the hip in a way that actually, when you look at Unix and the internet, you're like, well, what if Unix and the internet were actually one system? And you're like, you know what? They actually are one system. And like, to the extent that you're running something that's not Unix, then that's on the internet. It's basically faking what all the daemons on all of these private ports do. And it's like saying, oh, a Unix box does this on port 80, so we'll do that on port 80. Right? We're running HTTP. And so you're essentially kind of combining the network endpoints with a stack of system services behind them. And when you basically say, and the thing I say in this deck that I was about to repeat, which is I think an interesting point, when you look at the competition for decentralized identity spaces, you see that in a way, Urbit's main competition is the Ethereum name system, ENS. And actually, some very, very capable people in this thing, Farcaster, have actually built a very, very cool social network, which is basically a Twitter clone based on ENS names, which is semi-decentralized in a very, very clever way and really actually works very well. And it definitely has more users than we do. And so it's sort of, it's on a nice little takeoff trajectory. Of course, we're patient. We're still around after 20 years, and we're going to win in the end. And when you look at sort of the competition between Urbit names and ENS names, you notice a couple of things. One is that it's very, very easy to basically take, and we already have, unfortunately, and I hate to be critical, but come on, guys. Like, somebody did not snag urbit.eth when we could have snagged it with the domain name. As a result, it is owned by a spammer. Dear spammer, if you're out there, turn yourself in. We will give you all the leniency that you deserve, with the power of the scepter of Urbit. But, frankly, you're a scammer and you have to admit it. So instead, we acquired this cool domain called urbit.box, which is both an ENS domain and a DNS domain, which is actually kind of cool. So I can have one address that's both an ENS name and an Urbit name and a DNS name. Pretty cool, right? So, but really what distinguishes between Urbit and ENS in an effective way is the fact that, as I say in the stack, I'm like, you will never be able to make a phone call to an ENS name. You can't make a phone call to Sargnampive at present, but in the future you might be able to. Because essentially, like a Unix system, which is, an operating system, what you're doing in Urbit that's really precious is you're attaching a stack of system services to this endpoint. And so if I have a Unix system which has an address, I always know that I can, port 80 is going to do something HTTP-like. It's not going to pretend to be SMTP. And so actually standardizing the connection between the stack of system services and the endpoints basically allows you, imagine just the world of Bitcoin. So many people out here have, been in the world of Bitcoin. Imagine if you could message a Bitcoin endpoint. You could say, hey, Bitcoin address, what's up with this? That's sort of lurching toward existence with something like Nostr, for example. But there's a big problem with this. If you basically say, sure, you can attach a service. It's relatively easy to build some service that sort of registers, and the really smart way to do it is the Groundwire way with Bitcoin ordinals that registers, some, service endpoint, connected to an NFT, a Bitcoin address, an ENS address, whatever. The problem is that you can't really assume that any ENS address has this endpoint. And so you're basically like, oh, can I make a phone call to an ENS address? Well, an ENS address that's installed the service, yes, you can make a phone call to them. But abstractly, it's a pretty lousy experience to say, oh, I want to make a phone call to this ENS address. There's a 1% chance that it's going to work because they've installed the software or registered the endpoint or whatever. That's a pretty low chance of working. Whereas if you basically, Urbit 4.0, whatever, not 4.0, because we do Kelvin versioning, of course. But, once basically part of the core Arvo stack is, an endpoint that does, RTSP or something that lets you make a phone call to an Urbit user, to an Urbit name, everyone has that. And that's why that sort of hard binding between the namespace and the basically stack of services is so powerful. And when you basically take that back into the world of like competing decentralized identifier, it's basically saying, it's not just that Urbit has this now and ENS doesn't have it now. Urbit barely has this now. But the thing is, there's no realistic world in which ENS gets it. And even if you build, and this is one of the things the Groundwire guys who I just talked to today are doing, is they're like, okay, we're going to use Bitcoin ordinals to like let you register an endpoint that is actually belongs to a given ENS key. You're still up against the question like, okay, how do I know that this ENS key is on Urbit? Because if the ENS key is not on Urbit, it won't work. Whereas if I have an Urbit name, I know it's on Urbit and I know it's going to work. And so, that advantage in terms of that competition for decentralized identity spaces renders Urbit very, very powerful in that combination because nobody else is going to have it. Even systems like Farcaster, Blue Sky, Nostr are fundamentally kind of special purpose systems. It's hard for them to imagine turning into something general purpose like this. They're all three of those are very cool, well-designed systems. And, frankly, anyone who's interested in Web3 systems technically should check those designs out. They're really, really, really good. But they're, essentially, with no disrespect to the people behind those designs, a general purpose system is always going to beat a special purpose system. Because if you have a special purpose app that succeeds, the general purpose system can always say, oh, we're just going to implement the app. Oh, we're going to extend and embrace your protocol. And so if the app wins, the OS wins. And if the app loses, the OS wins. And so, I kind of have no fear of that outcome. But essentially this notion that, the long-term value of we are building a namespace with an operating system behind it basically creates an environment for which there's, apart from various Urbit clones or forks or whatever people do, that's sort of the only real competition there. And I think that, however, what has really held up Urbit, and let me just sort of, before we take questions here, because unfortunately I don't have that much time at the Explorers Club. They're going to find me soon here. I snuck in here, and they're exploring. They're looking for me right now. You can hear the thumps in the. So before I'm kicked out of the Explorers Club, let me go through basically the policy that we're, or sort of the mission that we're performing here, which is to say, how do we make the decentralized identity system? How do we build as much of that while acknowledging that building a decentralized operating system, a decentralized, purely functional operating system on a technology platform and approach that's never been done before? We have to expect, for example, that when you're building a decentralized operating system, every time you try to scale up the user base by 10, you are going to encounter a new category of decentralization scaling problem that you've never seen before. Once your network is big enough to attract spammers, then your theoretical spam resistance becomes an actual spam resistance problem. And the thing is, the fact is basically Urbit as it is now, hosted, especially when it's hosted by really, effective battle-tested hosting companies like Plon or Red Horizon, it stays up. Your Urbit stays up. It works. Okay, it's not crashing all the time. It's not but to get from hundreds or thousands of systems on a running network stay up and work and talk to each other again and can upgrade themselves over the network, this is really not a small achievement. To get from that to millions, billions even, that's a huge achievement. And so what we want to ensure is that the growth of the society is never going to be contingent on the development of this relatively advanced, essentially CS research technology. And that leads us to basically the first of the things that the Urbit Foundation engineers are working on right now. Just grasping the scepter again. Again, this is the scepter of a vizier, maybe a grand vizier, maybe a petty vizier, some kind of vizier, right? And these are all classical Persian weapons behind me. All of these have been used to kill a man, right? And they may be used that way again. And the that's why they're here. I was a lot of weapons at the Explorers Club, but this is a special place. And so what we're building as our first kind of technical project is something we call captive apps, which is a very, very simple idea. The idea is that basically you should be able to use your decentralized Urbit identity almost as if you were using sign in with Google to essentially, build an Urbit app which is part of the Urbit experience, but whose backend is, let's not put too fine a point on it, entirely fake. And by the fact that when I say fake, I don't mean it doesn't work. It works great. It just means it's not decentralized at all. And your identity is basically a row in a database. And so essentially the stupid way of doing that, which is what we're going to do first, and what we're already working on, is, okay, what is the standard framework for doing this in a way that's just like your captive app is basically just a web app. It may have some business logic in Urbit's language Hoon, but it's just a web app. It's backed by, various sharded and SQLite databases. Cloudflare has a great product for that. People are looking into it. Just standard web slop backend 2020s style. But when integrated into your Urbit experience, it feels as if you were using a decentralized system, and you're certainly using it under a decentralized name. Not a very technically difficult problem to basically build an identity system, which is referring to the Ethereum blockchain. Hasn't been done. And it wasn't the priority. Right. And so, doing that, also connecting, so that basically allows you to connect this identity space to Web 2. To connect it to Web 3, again, we have sorgnamptype.urbit.box, writing like, ENS resolvers. That's a slightly different, that's part of the blockchain team. But, this problem of how do we basically build a system such that the expansion of Urbit as a society, Urbit is a world of people with reputations and identities and histories and status and credentials, even bound to these crazy names like sorgnamptype. How do we grow that and build it? Like, we are just not in a position in that competition. Maybe we could get away with waiting for system software research, but we're not in a position to wait for that. So that building that is one of the important tasks of the Urbit Foundation that people are working on now, because the whole engineering team, we've got 15 engineers at the Urbit Foundation, many of whom, chose to basically stay and work for stars instead of cash, which really shows you the level of, sort of commitment to this process. Because again, I think the UF got way closer to the end of its runway than it should have been allowed to be. And we're basically in here fixing that and saving it and making sure we keep this amazing talent pool intact and working. But when we look at basically the two sets of things that need to be done on this, we see, okay, there's a lot of maintenance work. Some of them may shift over to Tlon, because Tlon really needs basically really good Arvo maintainers to drive their like fully decentralized product. At the same time, we're over here at the Urbit Foundation working on how can we fake it. Moreover, how can we fake it is not really enough. What you want to say is, okay, if I'm building apps in the system, I can build out an application and grow it with all the growth hacking and all the speed that it takes in building totally conventional backend apps. But I also want to be able to take that, centralized experience and smoothly adapt it into a decentralized experience. And I want people who are using their centralized identities on some centralized social app to basically say, okay, I'm going to move this to decentralized mode. And that's just going to work. And like suddenly my application experience won't change at all because it's now decentralized. That's a relatively difficult and interesting problem. That's going to take a little more time. That's the first of three things we're working on. The second thing we're working on is basically various upgrades and improvements to the core Urbit blockchain contracts. And there's a lot of questions open there. What exactly are we doing? What chain will it be on? There's some movement toward, Coinbase Base. The crazy Bitcoin maxis at Groundwire have come in and made a case for actually moving the contract to Bitcoin ordinals. That sounds not doable, but apparently it is doable in like a really cool way. So that's sort of something that we have to think about. there's a lot of basically, so just sort of contract, sort of blockchain stuff design. That's the second area. And the third area, which is kind of the most fun in a way, I don't know that I sort of wanted to show some mock-ups here, but I want to maybe iterate a little more till we've had something that wasn't invented in the last 2 days. But is essentially right now there are sort of 3 directions, or as of previously, there were kind of 3 directions of like working on top level user interfaces to Urbit. There was Landscape, which was the core application interface. There was Bridge, which is the core wallet interface. And there was Sky, which was the experimental new sort of namespace browser for this system. And I think one of the things that is absolutely essential is that all 3 of these things become one thing. And what that one thing is, and again, we're working on a bunch of UI design, and like, this is experimental. I don't know if that works out. Take it with a grain of salt. One way to think about this one thing is basically to think of it, my digital life, rendered graphically is like it's a square on a screen. And on the square on the screen, you're not doing stacking windows like a regular window manager. You're doing tiling windows, so they all tile basically the plane. And then your whole digital life is within a square on your screen. And like you actually zoom in to smaller pieces of it when you want to go in and like see a document. You're basically, that document is like a millimeter across in the full picture of your digital life. But you can basically zoom in, to a detail of that and find it. That's called, this is not a new idea. It's a tiling user interface. It's a zoomable user interface. And how we integrate this with basically what the like Sky people have done in developing this advanced browser for this new application interface, and what we don't want to do with captive apps, and what we don't want to do with basically wallet apps that are only working on the wallet, like Bridge as it is, currently, and bringing that into a single thing that is a single Urbit interface is basically what a bunch of the kind of visual and interaction designers are working on at present. And so, sort of all of these things harmonize basically short to medium term goals of the project with kind of long-term places where we want to go. And that's what people at the Urbit Foundation are working on today. And as for all these other companies, you got to ask them. All right, Justin, can we take a few questions here?
Yeah, let's do it. And that was great, Curtis. There was a lot of interesting and surprising little pieces of information and, details there.
And medieval weapons.
Yeah, very much so. But it's cool to hear that, especially on that last point, that vision of a zoomable interface. I've never heard that before. That's pretty interesting stuff.
It's not a new idea. It's not my idea, but it's something that sort of only be done in kind of researchy contexts. So, but it sounds cool, so let's do it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And you did drop a few gems and nuggets there that are kind of interesting. So that's good. So I'm going to start with my own question, just trying to kind of think about things and read the room. I know you can't talk too much about fundraising, and I know that I understand all that stuff is always sensitive, of course. But maybe you could just give us a little bit of a vibe check. Like what's the feel? What's the vibe? What are you hearing? What are you seeing in people's faces? Just give us anything. Can you give us anything about the mood and the vibe of what it's like out there pounding the table?
Well, first of all, I would say, it's generally going well. I wouldn't give more details than that, but it feels like it's going well. Secondly, in terms of the market and the whole space, we're, I think, in an interesting period where you had this sort of huge boom of like all of this crypto economy and these crypto projects in 2021 and 2022. And I think that many of these, many of them are in this sort of somewhat zombified state where these projects are like, especially the best ones are like real technical ambitions, real nerds writing real code, but there's not necessarily a path for them to go anywhere. And so they're kind of sitting there with like, 9-figure treasuries and 10-figure market caps. And like, it's very hard for that market to effectively clear. And I think that basically the sort of the future question of like building things like this is like, you have to separate, like, first of all, you have this enormous influx of like bubble energy into the whole space in 2021 and 2022. And that created a lot of distortions. There's nothing worse than being overvalued and overrespected. It makes you have a horribly high opinion of yourself. It's the worst possible thing. Unfortunately, I was out of the building, so I missed that, but I'm sure it would have corrupted me as well. And and then you have this sort of a hangover from this where everyone was just like, wow, like this can't possibly work. Everything is, you have, really Urbit has a number of different ways in which it's been in the trough of the Gartner hype cycle. And so actually starting up the ramp of the Gartner hype cycle again is people realize, no, actually, this is a real thing. This is like, there are very few things that are realer than this thing. It's really quite real. It's a sort of difficult time because there's a lot of challenges that come out of all of this turbulence of hitting rock bottom in a way. But you're also you sense that the curve is uphill, and that creates a lot of optimism. And it's kind of fun to be in that situation where you can kind of feel it's working, but nobody else in the world can really tell that it's working, but it is in fact working.
Okay, great. Awesome. Let's go with this question from Fogbus. Fogbus asks, what does leadership expect the incentive to be for operating stars, if any, in the next 5 years? Operating rather than hodling. If the expectation is
for operating stars, it's really hard to predict the economics of operating stars. And this is one reason it's very hard to value a star outside of the planets that it owns, because it's okay, do you pay for being sponsored? How much do you pay for being sponsored? Is that bundled with hosting? How does that actually work? And the answer is, I basically don't know. But the meta answer is basically one of the things that you see in a kind of crypto project that, I sort of maybe arrogantly consider Urbit sort of superior to, is that you have all these kind of yield farming flows and all these ways in which kind of somewhat Ponzi-nomic money goes sort of around in a circle. And when I see these kinds of yield circles and so forth, I'm it doesn't feel good to me. So basically, if you're looking for how do I basically get yield on my Urbit tokens, I'm not maybe in that way.
Can you say anything at all about the Urbit tail scale situation and stars as infrastructure?
Oh, well, some people are doing, a kind of cool project. It's one of the projects. I mean, there's so many Urbit projects and so many Urbit companies. This one, unfortunately, has not chosen a name, which is what requires us to refer to it as Urbit Tailscale. But, they've been actually more busy on writing code. But, the essential idea is to use Urbit as sort of the communication layer for something very like Tailscale, and essentially get to the point where you can build VPNs as Tailscale does, basically private, overlay networks using Urbit addressing, using the Urbit network as a way to basically find, to connect to the system, to connect to each other, right? And that's yet another cool example of using the Urbit namespace as an endpoint. And it sort of, reminds us basically just how valuable it is to have these endpoints that are both feel like human names and are as memorable as human names and yet work as well. They have exactly the same number of bytes as IPv4 addresses, of course.
Okay, cool. Great. Thanks. There's a question here from Sarlev. The question is, are you going to let these Web 2 apps have a default take my data with me button to export it to my Arvo?
You would absolutely like to have that button. Of course, you can't require that button to exist because it's non-trivial, but that's exactly what I'm talking about from the perspective of incremental decentralization. Ideally, you shouldn't notice any change at all in the application. That's that's a big step. That's an ambitious, basically structural request of any system like this, but I believe it's achievable.
Okay, great. There's a question here from Backpill Barless. The question is it true that you are the most ruthless CEO in the tech world, that you hired investigators to spy on Microsoft, that you instigated hostile takeover of multiple podcasts, and donated $500 million to delay publishing of your book?
I can't comment on any of these things, but Microsoft is going down. Watch this space. There's a reason I appear with all these traditional weapons behind me. They're not going to know what hit them.
Okay, I'll add a general follow-up on that for everyone. Do you have thoughts on what's your management style? How do you think about management? What have you learned over your time of building companies?
That's a good question. My management style is that I'm a terrible organizer and manager, and really what I do is sort of more set direction and strategy. There were actually, in terms of replacing managers with, I'm not even the interim executive director of the Urbit Foundation. That's Topher, who's taken on a kind of COO kind of role. And so, actually what was missing, I would say, in the entire Urbit space is someone who felt a kind of strategic responsibility for the whole system. People felt more of a responsibility for the kind of their own areas in a way. And that led to a lot of kinds of like conflict. And, the most important job of any leader is like creating and maintaining unity. I can easily point to the things that I screwed up in the last month, basically on that front. But, that is clearly the most important thing, basically, facing us now.
Okay, great. Thank you. There's some rumors here in the chat saying that the owner of Urbit.eth is Martin Shkreli. So I don't know. We'll see. We'll see if we can find it out.
We'll see. Maybe he traded it to the Wu-Tang Clan. I don't know. But if Shkreli owns it, whoever spammer that you are, come forward, face justice, and like you will be spared. All right. I do have to run in a second. One last quick question.
Oh, okay. I thought we had a little bit more.
Sorry, I got cut a little short.
Okay, yeah, sure, no problem. Last question would just be, tell us what's going on at Subassembly. What are you going to talk about, and who should go or who should be paying attention to that?
At Subassembly, in Oregon, I believe October 20th. I'm going to be there. I'm going to talk about governance. Obviously, I have strong opinions about governance, and it'll be an interesting and very intimate and fun time.
I think that's open to applications. Yeah, so if people want to go, that's out in the Pacific Northwest, Mount Rainier. It's open for
deep woods. Bigfoot will be present in spirit, if not in the flesh. It will happen.
Check it out.
You should go if you're into Urbit. So, all right. Peace out, everyone. The Vizier has spoken, maybe the Petty Vizier. And thank you so much, Justin, for a very fun and edifying evening.
Over and out. Thanks, Curtis.
Take care.
All right, everybody. Well, that's a wrap. Thanks for coming out. I believe we're going to do this every month. So stay tuned. If you haven't yet already, just subscribe to the YouTube channel if you're watching on YouTube. Subscribe to the Twitter if you're watching this on Twitter. And if you're interested in participating next time, go and get an Urbit chip. We'll put a link in the show notes. You can get them for free from Red Horizon now, and they provide the hosting. And we'll even include the radio app installed for you before you even open up your ship. Okay, and you can join the live chat and AMA there. So we'll see you same time, same place next month. Thanks, everybody. Over and out.